Good morning. It's a great pleasure to introduce Pam Koide here today. Pam is known for many years all over the world. She's not just our member, she's all over the world. And she's coming today to tell us about Talansias, in particular, her Talansias experiences with nobody else than Werner Rauh. She accompanied him on several trips to Central Mexico, Central America, and Peru. And the background of that has now been collected in Bonn by the German government, so that access to all that old information is now become available. And Pam has collected this all, and she knows the topic better than anybody else. We're going to hear about that today. So welcome, Pam. We all want to hear about it.
Okay. Am I on now? There we go. All right. I will thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me come and present another meeting on Zoom. I'm just going to make one correction. I only made one expedition with Werner Rauh, and that was to Peru for almost a month, 3.5 weeks. I did go to the Colorado desert with him for a couple of days during a cactus and succulent meeting, but that's it. He had invited me a couple of times to go to Madagascar, and that's probably one of the biggest regrets of my life, not going to Madagascar with him in the 80s. That would have been an amazing experience. So let me see if I can share my screen. Share. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
That's good. And you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, Professor Werner Rauh lived, I think, 86 years. He was born in 1913 and passed away on April 7th, 2000. So we just passed the anniversary of when he passed away. So I'm going to talk a little bit about him and the Werner Rauh Heritage Project that was they started working on it in 2007. And then I will show a little bit about the trip that I took with Werner in Peru, which was in 1988. So it's not a complete topic on Peru. If you'd like me to do a topic on Peru, I can do that maybe later in the year or next year, as I went to Peru again last September. So a lot of things have changed, and I have many different images. Many of these images are from slides that were scanned, so the quality isn't as good as you'll see today in digital photography. So he went to the University of Halle, and he practiced under the famous morphologist Wilhelm Troll. And he got his doctorate in 1937. In 1939, he was an assistant professor he was an assistant to Professor Seibold at the University of Heidelberg. And then in 1956, he accepted a full professorship at the University of Heidelberg. Interesting, at the same time, he was offered a directorship of the famous botanical garden in Berlin, but he declined that. He wanted to stay in Heidelberg. During his time at Heidelberg from 1960 to 84, when he retired, he was the chair of the Institute of Systematic Botany, Plant Geography, and the director of the University Botanical Gardens. When he started, there were 3 greenhouses, and he increased that to 15 during his tenure. And the greenhouses were amazing. He had different, like the Madagascar house alone was mind-boggling, with all the specimens that he had brought in from Madagascar, and the plants from Africa, and Bromeliad house and Cactus house. It's really an amazing place to visit. Let's go to the next slide. Whoops. Okay. So he made numerous expeditions. Between 1950 and 1994, he made more than 60 expeditions. So he started his travels right after World War II, during the Reconstruction period at the University of Heidelberg, and he traveled to the Atlas Mountains of North Africa. And then he went to Peru and then into Ecuador. Incidentally, during the war, he worked as a meteorologist and was stationed in Heidelberg at that time. So his first expedition to Peru was in 1954. And I would tease him because that was the year that I was born and he was making his first expedition. But it was a lot harder to travel back then. It took him 3 months by boat to get to Peru because there were no airplanes that were flying to Peru. And then the traveling around Peru wasn't easy. So once he got there, he would take trains to major destinations. And then from those localities, he would travel by horseback into the mountains for months at a time. His first couple of expeditions were with his wife, Hilda. Years later, when he, on a subsequent trip, he ended up shipping his Land Rover from Germany to Peru and leaving it in Chiclayo so that when he went, he had his own vehicle for traveling. In 1956, he made his first expedition to Madagascar for a total of 10. So Peru and Madagascar are the two areas that he traveled to the most. He was also a prolific writer and contributor to many journals, not only Cactus and Succulent, but the Bromeliads Society journal as well. And he also had the publication Bromelian Studies from the Botanic Garden. So more than 300 articles and 24 books. He discovered 1,200 taxa and 700 he described himself. Of the 24 books, there's several that are on bromeliads, and the first few here on the right were in German initially, but then he put out several that are in English, and they're really good informational books that talk about the geography and climate of Mexico and Peru both, and show you how the plants have adapted and live in these environments. So if you ever get the opportunity to get these books, they're really a good resource. I think he also wrote 7 or 8 books on cactus, including The Wonderful World of Succulents. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And then his final publication was the 2-volume monolith on the plants of Madagascar, which is a beautiful book. He had great photography and great descriptions of all of the plants. And so it really, the two volumes cover all the diversity of the plants and families that are in Madagascar, including Aloaria, aloes, euphorbias. And then look at the image here on the left, you'll see there's a little tiny postcard, and that was included there. One thing about Werner Rauh, wherever he traveled, he would always get postcards and write little notes about his travels or where he was, whether he was in Brazil or Argentina or Venezuela, and send them to people that he knew around the world. And everyone that he got to know, he treated pretty much as a good friend. I had numerous postcards and letters from him that are all handwritten. And I think that if he was around today, he would probably be an active Instagram poster, because he certainly loved to communicate with people. So there's 195 taxa named in his honor. Amaryllis, genus Raulia from Peru, and that's the flower right there on the Raulia. We'll see the plant later. Cactus genus, an example would be Rauia, also from Peru. The orchid genus, Raulia from Brazil. And then of course the species Aloe Rauii from Madagascar. And that's a very popular decorative plant now in the succulent collections everywhere. So his main interests were bromeliads, cactus, and succulent plants. So of the 54 genera of bromeliads, these species were described by Rauh. So in Talansia, there's 85 that he described. Most of them, there's just 1 or 2. But there's several Dickeas, 10 of those. In 1995, the genus Raulia was dedicated to him, and that includes 92 species. So a total of 700 species is that he was the primary or co-author of all plant families. So where were his expeditions and where did he go? So all of the green areas are places that he traveled to. He had more than 60 expeditions. After World War II, the first expedition was to the Atlas Mountains here in the Morocco area of Africa. And then he followed up with his expeditions to Peru and Ecuador with his wife, Hilda. Excuse me. So I've counted out the number of expeditions, and the ones that are in yellow are the areas that he went to the most and where he made the most collections. He would collect not only flowers and put them in bottles with alcohol, he would collect plants and herbariums and do his descriptions, and all of these went back to Heidelberg. So you can see in Brazil, he made 5 trips, 1,900 collections were there. In Ecuador, he made 5 trips as well, 3,300 collections were made there. Interesting, he only made 1 trip to Israel, but he made 1,000 collections. So that's a high number of collections for just 1 trip. 6 trips to Mexico, 3,000 collections, and Peru. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 12 trips and 8,890 collections. So a lot of material from Peru and a lot of material, I think 10 trips in Madagascar and another 7,000 collections. That's a lot of material to take care of and to catalog and look at. So during his collecting, he had over 195 field books, including 8,776 pages, 32,000 entries, 19,000 collections with field numbers. He also had a few collections without field numbers, and then photographs and documents, over 90,000. He was an avid photographer, and you have to remember back then we didn't have digital photography, so he would take initially film photography and later slide photography. He would carry 2 cameras, one with black and white film and one with color film. And he kept a separate log for his photography and another log for the plants. Okay, so the Werner Rauh Heritage Project was started in 2007, I think was the initial time. And the purpose was to be able to take all this information and put it into a database where it's accessible by researchers around the world, because it's just a treasure trove of information. And so how do you do that? And how do you go about making that work? So they started in 2007, 2008, and 2009, they started scanning all the field books. They started digitizing all the herbarium specimens. And then they were creating a database to try and tie everything together and make it work so that it can be accessible on the web. They not only did digital images of the herbarium sheets, but somebody also went through the entire botanic garden and started taking digital images of all the plant material that's still living in the garden so that it can be connected with the plant ID number, and then connecting those with images that he took in the field as well. So you can see this is a lot of work and it took a lot of time. So they started with the project 2007, and it was finally ready to be announced to the public in 2013. So there were some difficulties because his handwriting wasn't always legible. I don't know if you can figure out what this says, but the first word is Cissus quadrangularis. This is gloriosa, and then 2 euphorbias. So they had to spend a lot of time deciphering his handwriting so that that could go into the project. And then there's some other difficulties associated with his field books. His numbering system was different from in the beginning to where it was in the end. In the beginning years, he started, when he was collecting cactus, the field books, he had a numbering system starting with the letter K, 7. And so that was collected in 1954. Later, he would put K for cactus and then the year in Roman numerals, 1956, or number 42. So there was no consistency. Sometimes he would put P for Peru, sometimes M for Madagascar, T for Tanzania. So they had to come up with a system that would make sense, that would work in the database. So they standardized the page numbering of his books. So here's the example. This would be a page number, Heidelberg, Rauh collection, and then the field book number would be here, and then the booklet, and then the page number. So now you can access, all the books are online. And so they have images of each book, they have the date, what they covered, the locality. And then they use the SQL database to tie everything together. So you can choose the country, and you can find the different itineraries. They have a breakdown of the exact itinerary for that country for that year. And then they have a list of all of his IDs for the taxon that he had collected are noted in his notes. And then it gets tied up to maps and to images. So here's an example of Talansia ionantha from one of his field books. Right here you can see his number and the species. And so that would then be going into a database entry that would then be connected to the images. And these are now, this one is connected to the images of that plant that was collected, but is still growing at Heidelberg in the Botanic Garden. So how does that work for you or I? There's, if you're interested, you can go to the website and they allow you to sign on as a guest using the ID GAST, and there's no password. But you can go in and you can search. You can just search by plant or by locality or by year, and you'll get different lists. So doing a simple search for Talansia reducta comes up with these 6 entries in all of his field notes. And you can see one was in 75, 76, 88, and 88 again. This is what the species looks like. This is my image. Another example would be Talansia cacticola. And then when you click on I'm gonna go back one second. When you open up these entries, then you'll get a picture of the book, the name of the book, or the number of the book, the entry for that species, and you'll see the page. And then you can click on the page and it will take you to a bigger image of the page. So this was for cacticola. So I was able to find his field notes for the trip that I made with him in 1988 to Peru. Prior to coming to Peru, he was in Venezuela for a couple of weeks before, and I met him in Peru. So it's really fun for me to be able to look through his notes, which are certainly more complete than my notes. Here we have Talansia Raui, a variety Longispica, and here's the collection number, and here's the plant in the field. So here we're looking at Talansia Humulus, and it comes up here in the book. And then you can see, again, the details over here of the species, and this is what Humulus looks like. So the Werner Rauh Heritage Project at the Heidelberg Botanical Garden is more than 10,000 living specimens, and these are still being photographed in high resolution. They may be completed by now. They're also photographing the type specimens and the vouchers, all his photographs, all his field notes, and all of that's being placed into the searchable database. And in some instances, it's connected to Google Maps, where you can see on a map where the locality is of where he found that. I think at this time, though, they're not doing that for cactus, but and only a few of the bromeliads have the maps. So papers were published to announce the project in 2013 at the time of celebrating his 100 years since his birth. So it's really an amazing project, and there's a lot to learn from being able to access his information, certainly for researchers in the field and other botany people. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Peru and about the trip that we made in 1988. So Peru has the very west, the yellow portion is the western coastal desert. It's a very dry area. It gets very little rain. In fact, it's covered in fog for probably 7 or 8 months a year. And that's about the only water that it gets. Then you have the mountains that rise up, and then they go into the inter-Andean valleys. And then you have the eastern slopes, which go into the eastern lowlands and into the jungles. So the climate is tropical in the east, and it's dry in the desert in the west here, and it's cool in the mountains. So when I met Rauh in Lima, we spent the first few days traveling with Klaus von Bismarck and Dr. Carlos Ostalanza, who was the, actually he was the founder of the Cactus and Succulent Society of Peru. So he has a strong interest in cactus, and he would travel with Werner on several occasions when he came to Peru. So we drove from Lima up the coast to Chiclayo, and in order to get into the mountains, you follow different river valleys. So you can't, and it's all switchback trails. And so you usually have to come to the coast, go down, and then go up another river valley, and then come back down and go up another. And so we did this, and driving up the coast, and then we started at the northern area and then worked our way down. He also taught me a little bit about some of the cactus species that are popular or that are found in Peru. This is an interesting one, Hegeoceras tenuis. It almost looks like snakes growing along the ground. This is in that coastal desert area. And as you can see here, it's just complete sand. There's just, here we have the cactus species, a few latifolias over there. There's not really much that grows here because there is not much water. It's mainly fog. And all of these plants will grow towards the Pacific coast in search of the fog and the moisture that comes from that area. Latifolia grows in these areas, or used to grow in these areas. And there's many different sizes and shapes of latifolia. They range from some that are only a ½ inch in diameter to others that are maybe 2 feet in diameter. Narrow leaves, thick leaves, succulent leaves. And again, they all grow towards the coast. Not all of them are viviparous, putting out pups on the inflorescence, but many of them are. And here you can see they put up their pups, and then they'll end up climbing up. And when the weight gets so heavy, they'll lie down in the direction of the moisture growing towards the coast. And like I said, there's many different sizes and forms. And they also grow with purpurea, also many different sizes of forms of purpurea that grow in this coastal desert area. So when we were there, actually in 1983, I think there was a La Nina. When we have an El Nino here, there's a La Nina down in the Peruvian coast.
As Adrian talked, the neurons can get overstretched. They're delicate things. We have the issue.
Somebody needs to mute him. When there's a La Nina, there's an abundance of rainfall. Now, this is a coastal desert area that's normally dry and not used to getting lots of rainfall. When the rain comes from the La Nina, it floods and it kills millions of plants. We were there 5 years later, and you can see after the water recedes, you can see the cracks in the sand left over from the flooding. Even though the plants do die, they did start to, here we are 5 years later, there's new plant growth that is starting to emerge out of those areas. Sometimes there's a Talansia Latifolia. Graffiti is a cultivar name, and was given because oftentimes the locals will use the latifolias and gather them up and write words on the hillsides. Now this is the coastal desert and how most of it looked in 1988. There were sand dunes, there was nothing between the Pacific Ocean, and as the mountains start to crawl up into the Andes, it was pretty much all sand dunes. Well, a lot of this is now gone. When I was there in September, it's almost completely gone, and it's now an agricultural area. A lot of the farmers are growing asparagus. In fact, that's one of their richest crops in Peru, is the asparagus that they export around the world. And it's all being cultivated in this area where all these latifolias used to grow. So now to see the latifolias, you have to go down some other side roads and away from the coast into some of the valleys where you can still find some. But the abundance of latifolia diversity that did exist in 1988 does not exist today. On the way to Chiclayo, we passed the town of San Pedro de Oque, and this is where the Italian botanist Antonio Raimondi was buried. He's also famous for Pouyamedica, and that is the largest bromeliad growing, and it takes a long time for it to come into bloom, and it grows at a really high elevation, almost 15,000 feet. This area is also pre-Inca civilizations, the Mochi culture, and it flourished in the northern Peru coastal regions around Trujillo, and they depicted Talansias on their pottery and in their art. So here on the left, you can see he's holding looks like a purpurea. And here's some of the different types of images that they used in their art. On the top, we have different forms of latifolia. In the middle, we have purpurea. And then on the bottom, we have Guzmania monostachya and Talansia usnioides. And this was all written in one of the German publications that Werner Rauh and Klaus von Bismarck wrote an article about the use of bromeliad art by the Mochi culture. So once we got to Chiclayo, then Klaus and Dr. Ostalanza left us, and we met up with another German couple, a young couple, and a driver in this Jeep that we traveled to. And wherever Rauh went, he was very friendly and made he garnered lots of attention from the locals, especially the children, but he loved to be friendly and communicate with them. I want to point out a couple of things. He's wearing around his neck his altimeter. Well, back in the 80s, we didn't have all the high-tech technology that we have now. So we basically traveled with a camera and an altimeter, and that was about it, besides a map. And he also traveled in his collection trips, he traveled very light. He usually had 2 shirts for the field and 1 shirt a little nicer in case we went out to eat somewhere, and 1 or 2 pairs of jeans, and that was about it. And he would hand wash his shirts at night and hang them in his room. So this is our vehicle that we traveled in. We had baskets for collecting plants, but remember there's 5 of us, so 3 would be in the cab and 2 people would have to ride in the back the entire time. That's Franz, who was with us, and we had a cover for the Jeep because we were there in the rainy season, and you never know what's going to happen. So climbing into the mountains, we had narrow dirt roads to get up into the Andes. Some of the roads were so narrow, and sometimes you would be passing other vehicles, and it would cause me some disturbance. So I got out and walked many times. Here you can see I'm well ahead of our vehicle, and I'm walking because it's a little easier, and I went about the same speed as the vehicle. As you leave the lowlands in the coastal desert, you start climbing up into the Andes. You go into an area that Rauh would call the rock cactus zone, and you start to see some cactus specimens. Here's Neoremondia gigantea, really large plant. Also growing in that area on the rocks is Deuteronia Longipetila, and it grows with Talansia mima and Espestoa lanata, the cactus specimen up there. And this is what Mima chilatensis looks like. It's one of the species that puts out pups on the inflorescence. We also found Talansia Latifolia Divericata, which is now Divericata. And then the large giant form Latifolia variety major. This is a really large plant. It has a long caulescent stem and just keeps growing and growing and can grow up to 6 feet long. And growing with it, we found Talansia perurensis, which is given the synonym is Talansia roselii. This is one that we had collected in the field, and you can see the dark striations and coloring in the plant in habitat that is very hard to replicate in cultivation. We made our way to Cajamarca, which is at about 3,000 meters. It's really cold here at night, and also in the daytime, it's much cooler. You can see the Spanish influence throughout Latin America as in all of the cathedrals that you'll find throughout Latin America. But also Werner would point out to me a lot of the different plants that have naturalized in the Andes that were brought over by the Spanish. Spartium gentium. Up in this area, we also found Talansia cacticola, and given the name because it likes to grow on cactus, but it can also grow epiphytically and also on rocks. We came across a few Picarnia species that were new to science that he ended up publishing years later. And I forgot to clarify the name of those 2 species, but there's many of these up on these higher elevations where it's cooler and moister. We were specifically also looking for a Peperomia dolabella, which had been recently published by Carlos in the Cactus and Succulent Journal in Peru. And it took us an entire day searching. We finally found that plant. One of the smallest Puya species that I've ever seen is Pouyamedica. And it's really cute. It's got a pink spike with almost black flowers. And the inflorescence is only about 5 or 6 inches long. And it's growing at this high elevation of 3,000 feet. Another Talansia species, he had originally told me this was Talansia pyramidata, but it is not. I don't know the name at this time. But here's looking into the valley of Cajamarca. You can see some of the cultivated lands and all the hillsides that have been actually cultivated since Inca times. The Incas would harvest all of the water and built the aqueducts and for planting all of their crops. So it's very green because we were there in the rainy season. And we got a bit of rain. Originally, Werner wanted me to go with him in October, which is his favorite time for traveling in Peru because it's the dry season, but I couldn't make it. So we pushed the trip back to January, February. And that was an interesting time because we ended up finding things that he may not have seen when you're there in October. But it also caused for a few disasters of, in this instance, he insisted that we take a shortcut through this field. And that didn't turn out too good. And then sometimes you run into a landslide when you're on the road. So you just have to work your way around everything. But one of the best joys of that trip was this species here, Talansia purpurescens, that we found. We were both in the front seat of the truck at the time and driving, and out of the corner of our eye, we both saw the same thing, this bright purple glowing plant, and we both yelled stop to the driver. And as we got out, we found, this is the plant specimen that we found, and it's just a spectacular plant. He ended up, it was a new species, and he ended up publishing it as Talansia purpurescens. And it was really interesting to see. The other thing that he did travel with was a voice recorder. And he looked at the plant and just started recording and dictating his entire description of the plant so that he would have all the details logged for when it was time to publish this species. Okay. So another plant that named after his wife Hilda is one of the 2 banded Talansias, Telencia Leukophila from Mexico. I'm sorry, Leukolepis from Mexico, has similar banding, but not as pronounced as Talansia hilda. This one he named after his wife, and it grows at a lower elevation where it's very hot on steep cliffs. And I did used to climb rocks, but I don't do so much anymore. So you can see the beautiful banding of hilda. And it grows in a really hot area and a really sandy soil. So when I started propagating mine, this is the one species that I used to always grow in pure sand and put it in one of the hottest places in the greenhouse. It's also one of the species that will make numerous offsets long before it ever gets to a mature size. So the smaller plant you get, the better you are, because you'll be able to produce more offsets and propagate more plants from it. If you wait till it's older, it will make only a few pups. Growing near there is the Amaryllis genus Raulia Peruviana, named after Rauh, and that's the flower. I bloomed it. I still have I think I propagated 4 or 5 plants from the one bulb that I had, and they bloomed for the first time for me a few years ago. Other species in this area, Talansia reducta, it's related to Tectorum, but has a really a short coalescent habit, growth habit. And then heteromorpha variety Raulia was published in 2005, and it was also a new variety that we had found and located on this trip. Heteromorpha is really an interesting species. It grows in mass quantities on the rocks. And in the lower elevations, as we start to climb up to 3,000 feet, the plants are smaller, but as you go around another bend of the turn, they get bigger and bigger, and they can get up to 6 inches in diameter and maybe 12 inches tall. So they really, really change their shape as you go up the Rio Chancay Valley. They grow from 500 to 1,200 meters. And so this one was named heteromorpha variety Rauhi. We also found, this was another stop moment when we both saw the same thing coming around a corner and we both yelled stop. There was a mass that was probably 4 or 5 feet wide and hanging down probably 20 or 30 feet of what looked like rope, just solid rope hanging on the side of the cliff. And that's this form of heteromorpho, and I used to always call it the rope type because that's what it was. It didn't have a name, and I think it was published in 2007 and named Talansia tomekii. It's related to the heteromorpha, but it's a little bit different. And it grows at about 2,400 meters. Also in this area is used to be Varesia espinosa, now Talansia espinosa. Talansia McBridiana longispica grows also in these areas. Actually, that grows near Cajamarca. And the McBridiana, there's 3 forms, but this is the regular one. The longispica is a little bit larger. And then Talansia Glauca, an unusual species. You can see it growing right here in this tree. And it makes a really tall inflorescence, probably 4 feet tall. The foliage is real glaucous, covered with white powder, hence the name. And it usually doesn't offset. And then Talansia cajamarquensis also grows in this area. I think when we originally collected it, we thought, we named it deadly eye, but we later learned that that's actually cajamarquensis. And then at the pass is Talansia coinensis, which grows at 3,000 meters and above. And in that habitat, the foliage is really, really dark red. And there's a really strong coloration in the inflorescence. In cultivation, the foliage is light green, and you rarely see much color in the inflorescence. Also at the higher elevations is Talansia Biflora, beautiful red spotting in the foliage, but this is another mesic species. These higher elevation, cooler species like lots of moisture. They don't have trichomes, so they don't have the ability to retain moisture in their foliage. This was collected as Varesia harmsiana, became Talansia harmsiana. A lot of these gray leaf Varesias are referred to as TVs, T for Talansia and Varesia, because they go back and forth. One year they're Talansia, another year they're Varesia. So they're lumped into as TVs. Another species that we found that was new that Professor Rauh named after me, Werner Koide. And then when this Werner became a Talansia, it could not be Talansia Koide because there was already a Talansia Koide. So it had to be given a different name. It was named Talansia Yaconorensis, which is the town where, or the locality of where we found this species. This was collected as Varesia sagastagi. Again, it's one of the gray leaf Varesias. When it became a Talansia, it couldn't have the same name because there was already a Talansia named that. So it became Talansia peruviana. So in the valley of Rio Chancay, here we find Talansia leimanii, and you can tell we're in the rainy season because the river is really brown because all of the rains from the mountains bring all the dirt and sand and mud into the rivers, and they will always be brown. And Talansia leimanii grows in this area. You can see how beat up plants look in habitat. And here I had one bloom last year in cultivation. And then we have Talansia Latifolia variety Leukophila, which grows, excuse me, with the leimanii. And this is one of the more unusual forms of Latifolia because it's got the recurved foliage. It's really thick, succulent-like. It's covered with trichomes, and it has a pendant inflorescence that gets a really nice coloration. It's probably my favorite of all of the Latifolias. Also growing here is Varesia Longispica. I'm sorry, Talansia Raui variety Longispica. And this was a new form and new variety from the regular form. And he published this in 1990. So we found this on our trip. So if you look here at if you go to the Heritage Project and you type in Raui variety Longispica, it will bring you to this collection detail. It was found in February of 1988. And there's his collection number, 69431. And then the detail of the book is right here, and you can see the notes. So here we have Raui variety Longispica. And it's got longer, narrower spikes than the regular Raui variety Raui. Interesting thing about the Raui Longispica and the Raui, as well as many of the Talansia oide types of Talansias, is when the flower first emerges, the female portion is exerted first. And once it's fully exerted, then you can see the male portions start to extend, and then everything finally extends beyond the petals. So here is Professor Werner Rauh with the Longispica variety Longispica, Raui variety Longispica, and you can see it's bigger than he is. The inflorescence is bigger than he is. And here's a picture from his publication when he described the species. And that's me right there, and that's our truck, and this is how we gathered up our specimens. So one of his favorite things was to be able to look to the west when we were high in the Andes every day afternoon. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you could see the thick fog coming in from the coast. And we would always stop and take pictures of that. And he loved that. And everything would then become drenched in thick fog. And that's how the plants in the Andes stayed cool and got most of their moisture. And with that, I'd like to thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm willing to answer them. Is everybody still there?
Okay, guys, you can unmute now.
You can wake up
Turn
now.
your video on.
Thanks, Pam.
Wow, that was great.
I have a question, Pam.
Yes.
Oh, me first. Is there a way on the site that you've kind of described where you can kind of work backwards? If you don't know any of the, if you know the locality that you're in, say you're in north of Cajamarca, north and east of it, where you can like look up stuff in a zone in a map, like zoom into a map
Well,
and see the
you
dots?
can go, like you can go to Peru and you can get a list of the itinerary. So from the itinerary, you could go to Cajamarca and then you can see his notes from those areas. So yes, I think you can also just search by locality and it might show you a listing.
That's cool.
Any other questions?
Can you comment on what the status is of the collection in Heidelberg today?
I don't know specifically, but I think it's protected and it's at the gardens and I think it's being taken care of properly. I know that like Renata's collection has been taken over and has been designated a protected status, and the Bromeliad Society is taking care of that. But his large collections are so broad and vast and covering so many different families, and I'm sure that the gardens is taking care of it all.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Pam,
Yes.
this is Nancy. Can you go over again, how do you get into, if you want to look at the project online, can anybody enter it or do you have, you said you
Yes,
don't?
anyone can enter it. Let me find the slide that had, I have the website, I think, on one of these slides. Okay, so this one, if you just take a picture of the screen, you can see the website here at the bottom.
Oh, at the very bottom, I got it. Okay, I didn't see that.
Yeah, or if you want, I could.
That's okay, I got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Or you can also, you can just do a Google search of the Werner Rauh Heritage Project and you'll eventually end up on a link. There is, to get into the database, you would have to click on, there's one section where you can click on database. You could just search Werner Rauh database.
Okay.
And there is a password and the password is guest. I'm sorry, the user ID is guest. The password, there is no password, but you spell guest the German way. So it's G-A-S-T.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't get that.
Mhm.
So G-A-S-T.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's really a treasure trove of information. And it's fascinating. And he traveled, all of his books from all of his countries that he went to are there.
Wow, yeah, that's great.
What an undertaking. That is
Yeah.
just mind
I
blowing.
wonder how many students they had working on this project for all of these years. And they had quite a bit of funding for the project as well. So
Yeah,
it's really
anybody
great.
who's tried to organize their own slides of where they've been and stuff, you can
Right.
how complicated it was.
Yeah. Yeah, but with him, with how many field notes and,
Wow.
and just all of the photography as well.
Dirty, good, great.
Homer, what are you doing here? So I don't know if you, come on.
Pam, that was so informative and very
My bird
interesting.
decided to come in and join me. I don't know if you guys heard him. I heard him walking in the room from behind me while I was talking. Yes.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yes,
any
we
other
had some
questions?
extra guests.
I only have I have a comment more than anything. Really, he named his poor wife Hilda after probably one of, I don't know, that plant in habitat looks so battered and dry and haggard all the time. He couldn't name it after a nice, beautiful mesic or some beautiful plant that grows up higher.
Which one?
Hildia.
Talansia
Oh,
Hilda.
Hildi. Oh,
Oh,
I don't know why.
I think it's a great
it has
plant.
beautiful banding, which is very unusual for, come on, Palmer, stay. It's unusual for a species. It's the only species. So that's a good thing.
yeah,
And
people
It's a
love
when
great
it's in
plant.
bloom, it's really big. It's probably taller than Hilda. So both of them have plants named after them with an inflorescence that's bigger than them. But I can't imagine what it was like. I used to tell him, I go, wow, I can't imagine what it was like to be able to travel for 3 months at a time on horseback, and what you found and all the discoveries that you made. And you compare that with the old explorers from many, many years ago, it was even harder for them. But nowadays with the technology, you know, we all have a GPS in our pocket. We all have a cell phone that takes pretty decent photographs, and you can take black and white and color in your cell phone. I didn't have the luxury of having 2 cameras, so if I wanted to do black and white, I had to re-roll my slide film, remember to what number I was on, and then put in the black and white film, and then take it out again, and then blindly roll it into the present position. And now, you know, I can be sitting here and get a text from someone in the field with a picture that they've taken and saying, hey, Pam, what's this species? I'm at this locality in Oaxaca. Can you tell me what this is? So it's just amazing how the technology has changed.
Yeah.
True.
Okay, so that's it, I guess.
Oh, well, thank you, Pam. That was so
I also brought
informative
in-
and just amazing.
Here's one of my Peruvian pectorums that's growing. It's the more upright form and quite large.
Wow.
Nice.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.